Educational reading. A summary view of the rights of British America, set forth in some resolutions intended for the present delegates of the people of Virginia, now in Convention 1774, Thomas Jefferson. Resolved, that it be an instruction to the said deputies, when assembled in General Congress with the deputies of the other states of British America, to propose to said Congress that an humble and dutiful address be presented to His Majesty, begging leave to lay before him, as Chief Magistrate of the British Empire, the united complaints of His Majesty's subjects in America, complaints which are excited by many unwarrantable encroachments and usurpations attempted to be made by the legislature of one part of the empire upon those rights which God and the laws have given equally and independently to all, to represent to His Majesty, and these His states have often individually made humble application to His imperial throne, to obtain through its intervention some redress of their injured rights, to none of which was ever even an answer condescended, humbly to hope that this their joint address, penned in the language of truth and divested of those expressions of servility which would persuade His Majesty that we are asking favors and not rights, shall obtain from His Majesty a more respectful acceptance, and this His Majesty will think we have reason to expect, when he reflects that he is no more than the chief officer of the people, appointed by the laws and circumscribed with definite powers to assist in working the great machine of government erected for their use, and consequently subject to their superintendence. And in order that these our rights, as well as the invasions of them, may be laid more fully before His Majesty, to take a view of them from the origin and first settlement of these countries, to remind him that our ancestors, before their emigration to America, were the free inhabitants of the British dominions in Europe, and possessed a right which nature has given to all men, of departing from the country in which chance, not choice, has placed them, and going in quest of new habitations, and of their establishing new societies under laws and regulations, as to them shall seem most likely to promote public happiness, that their Saxon ancestors had, under the universal law, in like manner left their native wilds and woods. In the north of Europe, had possessed themselves of the island of Britain, then less charged with inhabitants, and had established there that system of laws which has long been the glory and protection of that country. Nor was ever any claim of superiority or dependence asserted over them by that mother country from which they had migrated, and were such a claim made, it is believed that His Majesty's subjects in Great Britain have too firm a feeling of the rights derived to them from their ancestors, to bow down the sovereignty to their state before such visionary pretensions, and it is thought that no circumstance has occurred to distinguish materially the British from the Saxon emigration. America was conquered and her settlements made, and firmly established at the expense of individuals and not of the British public. Their own blood was spilled in acquiring lands for their settlement. Their own fortunes expanded in making that settlement effectual. For themselves they fought, for themselves they conquered, and for themselves alone they had right to hold. Not a shilling was ever issued from the public treasuries of His Majesty or his ancestors for their acceptance, till of very late times, after the colonies had become established on a firm and permanent footing, that then indeed have become valuable to Great Britain for her commercial purposes. Her Parliament was pleased to lend them assistance against an enemy who would fain have drawn to herself the benefit of their commerce, to great aggrandizement of herself and the dangers of Great Britain. Such assistance, and in such circumstances, they had often before given to Portugal or other allied states, with whom they carried on a commercial intercourse. Yet these states never supposed that by calling in her aid they thereby submitted themselves to her sovereignty. Had such terms been proposed, they would have rejected them with disdain, and trusted for better to the moderation of their enemies, or to a vigorous exertion of their own force. We do not, however, mean to underrate those aids, which to us are doubtless valuable, or whatever principles guaranteed, but we do shew that they cannot give a title to that authority which the British Parliament would arrogate over us, and that they may amply be repaid by our giving to the inhabitants of Great Britain such exclusive privileges in trade as may be advantageous to them, and to the same not too restrictive to ourselves. The settlements having been thus effected in the wilds of America, the emigrants thought proper to adopt that system of law under which they had hitherto lived in the mother country, and to their union with her by submitting themselves to the same common sovereign, who was thereby made the central link connecting the several parts of the empire thus newly multiplied. But that not long were they permitted, however far they thought themselves removed from the hand of opposition, to hold undisturbed the rights thus acquired, at the hazard of their lives and the loss of their fortunes. A family of princes was then on the British throne, whose treasonable crimes against their people brought on them afterwards the exertion of those sacred and sovereign rights of punishment reserved in the hands of the people for cases of extreme necessity, and judged by the Constitution unsafe to be delegated to any other judicature. While every day brought forth some new and unjustifiable exertion of power over their subjects on the side of the water, it was not to be expected that while every day brought forth some new and unjustifiable exertion of power over their subjects on that side of the water, it was not to be expected that those here, much less able at the time to oppose the designs of despotism, should be exempted from injury. Accordingly, that country, which had been acquired by the lives, the labors, and the fortunes of individual adventurers, was by these princes at several times parted out and distributed among the favorites and followers of their fortunes, and by an assumed right of the crown alone were erected into distinct and independent governments, a measure which is believed His Majesty prudence and understanding would prevent him from imitating at this day, as no exercise of such a power, and dividing and dismembering a country, however occurred in His Majesty's realm of England, though now of very ancient standing, nor could it be justified or acquiesced under there, or in any part of His Majesty's empire, that the exercise of free trade with all parts of the world possessed by the American colonists as of natural right, which no law of their own had taken away or abridged, was next the object of unjust encroachment. Some of the colonies have thought proper to continue the administration of their government in the name and under the authority of His Majesty King Charles I, whom, notwithstanding his late disposition by the Commonwealth of England, they continued in the sovereignty of their state. The Parliament for the Commonwealth took the same in high office and assumed upon themselves the power of prohibiting their trade with all other parts of the world, except the island of Great Britain. The arbitrary act, however, they soon recalled by solemn treaty entered into on the 12th of March 1651 between the said Commonwealth by their commissioners and the colonies of Virginia by their House of Burgesses. It was expressly stipulated by the 8th article of the said treaty that they should have free trade as the people of England do enjoy to all places, and with all nations according to the laws of that Commonwealth. But that, upon the restoration of His Majesty King Charles II, their right of free commerce fell once more a victim to arbitrary power, and by several acts of his reign, as well as of some of his successors, the trade of the colonies was laid under such restrictions as shew what hopes they might form from the justice of the British Parliament, where its uncontrolled power admitted over these states. History has informed us that bodies of men, as well as individuals, are susceptible to the spirit of tyranny. A view of these acts of Parliament for regulation, as it has been called, of the American trade, if all other evidence were removed out of the case, would undeniably evince the truth of this observation. Besides the duties they impose on our articles of export and import, they prohibit our going to any market northward of Cape Finisterre in the Kingdom of Spain for the sale of commodities which Great Britain will not take from us, and for the purchase of others with which she cannot supply us, and that for no other than the arbitrary purpose of purchasing for themselves by a sacrifice of our rights and interests certain privileges in their commerce with an allied state, who, in confidence that their exclusive trade with America will be continued while the principles and powers of the British Parliament be the same, have indulged themselves in the exorbitance which their avarice could dictate, or our necessities extort, have raised their commodities called for in America to the double and treble of what they sold for before such exclusive privileges were given them, and of what better commodities of the same kind would cost us elsewhere, and at the same time give us much less for what we carry thither than might be had at more convenient ports. That these acts prohibit us from carrying in quest of other purchasers the surplus of our tobaccos remaining after the consumption of Great Britain is supplied, so that we must leave them with the British merchants for whatever he will please to allow us, to be by him reshipped to foreign markets, where he will reap the benefits of making sale of them for full value. That to heighten still the idea of parliamentary justice, and to shew with the moderation they are like to exercise power where themselves are to feel no part of its weight, we take leave to mention to His Majesty certain other acts of British Parliament, by which they would prohibit us from manufacturing for our own use the articles we raise on our own lands without our own labor. By an act passed in the 5th year of the reign of His late Majesty King George II, an American subject is forbidden to make a hat for himself of fur which he has taken perhaps on his own soil, an instance of despotism to which no parallel can be produced in the most arbitrary ages of British history. By one other act passed in the 23rd year of the same reign, the iron which we make we are forbidden to manufacture, and heavy as that article is, and necessary in every branch of husbandry, besides commission and insurance, we are to pay freight for it to Great Britain, and freight for it back again, for the purpose supporting not men but machines in the island of Great Britain. In the same spirit of equal and impartial legislation, legislation is to be viewed the Act of Parliament passed in the 5th year of the same reign, by which American lands are made subject to the demands of British creditors, while their own lands were still continued unanswerable for their debts. From which one of these conclusions must necessarily follow: either that justice is not the same in America as in Britain, or else that British Parliament pay less regard to it here than there, but that we do not permit out of His Majesty the injustice of these acts, with intent to wrest that principle the cause of their nullity, but shew the experience before the property of those political principles which exempt us from the jurisdiction of the British Parliament. The true ground on which we declare these acts void is that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us, that these exercises of usurped power have not been confined to instances alone in which themselves were interested, but they have also intermeddled with the regulation of the internal affair of the colonies. The Act of the 9th of Annie for establishing a post office in America seems to have little connection with British convenience, except that the accommodating of His Majesty's ministers and favorites with the sale of a lucrative and easy office, that thus have we hastened through the reigns which precede His Majesty during which the violation of our rights were less alarming, because repeated at more direct intervals than that rapid and bold succession of injuries which is likely to distinguish the present from all other periods of American history. Scarcely have our minds been able to emerge from the astonishment into which one stroke of parliamentary thunder has involved us, before another more heavy and more alarming is fallen on us. Single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to accidental opinion of a day, but a series of oppositions begun at the distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers too plainly prove a deliberate and systematical plan to reduce us to slavery. That the act passed in the 4th year of His Majesty's reign entitled, An Act for Granting Certain Duties in the British Colonies and Plantations in America, and C, or %C. One other act passed in the 5th year of his reign entitled, An Act for Granting and Applying Certain Stamp Duties and Other Duties in the British Colonies and Plantations of America, and %C. One other act passed in the 6th year of his reign entitled, An Act for the Better Securing the Independency of His Majesty's Dominions in America upon the Crown and the Parliament of Great Britain, and one other act passed in the 7th year of his reign entitled, An Act for Granting Duties on Paper, Tea, and %C. Form that connected chain of parliamentary usurpation which has already been the subject of frequent applications to His Majesty and the House and the Houses of Lords and Commons in Great Britain, and no answer having yet been condescended to any of these, we shall not trouble His Majesty with the repetition of the matters they contained.